Clemson University is an old and history-rich school that has many different legacies throughout its many years in South Carolina. From its start in 1889, it has one legacy that will always be standing: its buildings. Many buildings that were built back then are still standing today, such as Hardin Hall. Many of these original buildings have a shady background though. Back when Clemson was originally founded, they used a system of forced labor on criminals and was one of the closest things to slavery at the time. Many of the shoe boxes were built first to house these workers. Most of these buildings built back then have plaques to explain the significance of who they are named after, but there is no significance of the workers who built them. Even a brick on the building with their name could even be the slightest way to honor them. But when these buildings were first started, many were built near and around John C. Calhoun's house. First built was Hardin Hall, then Tillman, and Godfrey Hall. As the years went on, they slowly expanded outward to create new education and living spaces for students. Through the expansions, many renovations also took place to keep the history of this college alive. No matter the role played, we need to honor these people and its creators.
If you do a Google search for Clemson University, one of the first images you'll see will be Tillman Hall, the longtime admissions building of Clemson University that overlooks the beautiful Bowman Field. This building is the first thing prospective students, current students, alumni, and visitors see when visiting Clemson, and has become the face of Clemson for both those who do and do not know about the school. With so much attention and recognition, it is assumed that Benjamin Tillman, the person Tillman Hall was named after, was an honorable man and someone who we as a Clemson family would want to represent our university. This, however, is not necessarily the case. Upon further research into Benjamin Tillman, you will discover that Tillman was born into a large slave-owning family on August 11, 1847, and from a young age helped his mother maintain the family inn and manage the plantation and slaves. By the time Tillman was old enough to own his own land, slavery had been abolished, but that did not prevent him from using freedmen laborers, which were not much better than slaves. Benjamin Tillman quickly became one of the most successful agricultural farmers in the South, owning more than 1,000 acres of land and operating over 30 plows. Tillman's success quickly earned him recognition from the state's prominent figures and led to his election as South Carolina's governor in 1890, where he served until 1894. As governor, his racist views began to become evident, as he constantly spoke about the importance of white supremacy, and the state of South Carolina as a whole saw a dramatic rise in the number of African American lynchings during his term as governor. In 1900, while discussing African Americans, Ben Tillman stated, "We of the South have never recognized the right of the black man to govern the white man, and will never will. We have never believed him to be equal to the white man, and we will not submit to gratifying his lust on our wives and daughters without lynching him." This is just one of the disgusting quotes Tillman has been documented saying. With all that being said, Tillman was still a very powerful figure in the state through his politics and wealth, and because of his long-term advocacy to create an agricultural college, he was able to meet with Thomas Green Clemson. On Clemson's deathbed, he shared his idea with Tillman of willing his estate to South Carolina to create an educational college. Tillman then led this movement with the help of a few others to make sure Thomas Green Clemson's vision came true. This led to Tillman becoming one of the original 7 successor trustees of Clemson Agricultural College. While Ben Tillman was largely responsible for the building and start of Clemson University, his actions and legacy create a troubling problem when it comes to recognizing him. The representation of Tillman on campus most notably comes from Tillman Hall. Due to this being the most recognizable and formerly most important building on campus, many believe that Tillman was this heroic figure that deserved to be honored. Without knowing the complete story and actual information on who Benjamin Tillman was, Clemson has tried to be more transparent with this controversial information by posting it on their website under the Historical Figures tab. But like the other monuments on campus, the information presented to those on campus glorifies these individuals, but if you want the entire story, you're going to have to search for it.
Strom Thurmond was another prominent figure in Clemson's history, but the Clemson website mentions him only once. In Notable People, under the History section on the Clemson About page, it reads, "Thurmond graduated from Clemson in 1923 and went on to become the longest-serving U.S. Senator in history. The Strom Thurmond Institute was built in his honor in 1989. However, Thurmond's impact was much more controversial than what was mentioned on the Clemson's webpage. After college, Thurmond started his career in politics, being elected to the South Carolina Senate in 1933. Thurmond quickly grew in popularity. According to Nadine Kahonda, The public viewed Thurman as a determined and gritty individual, which helped him become a political celebrity within the state. In 1942, Thurman enlisted in the military, earning the rank of lieutenant colonel as well as receiving 18 medals and awards, including the Purple Heart. After World War II, Thurman re-entered the political scene, becoming the governor of South Carolina. At this point, Thurman begins to implement his controversial racial views that Clemson University failed to mention on their webpage. While in office, Strom Thurmond supported the Jim Crow laws, which discriminated against all blacks and kept many of them from voting. Later, in 1948, Thurmond became a candidate for president in the States' Rights Democrats Party, also known as the Dixiecrats, in a response to Truman's proposed creation of a commission supporting anti-lynching laws and the elimination of state poll taxes, which kept blacks and poor whites from voting. According to a New York Times article in 1948, Thurmond stated that Truman, Thomas Dewey, and Henry A. Wallace would lead the U.S. to totalitarianism. Thurmond became so relentless in his racial views that in a speech in 1948 he said this:
"Ladies and gentlemen, that there's not enough troops in the army to force their southern people to break down segregation and admit the Negro race into our theaters, into our swimming pools, into our homes, and into our churches."
Later in his career, Thurmond wrote the Southern Manifesto, which announced disagreement with the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education case that ruled that public school segregation was unconstitutional. Yet after supporting racial segregation for most of his career, it was discovered that Thurmond fathered a mixed-race daughter, Essie Mae Washington, with his family's 16-year-old housekeeper, Carrie Butler. The Clemson website makes it seem like Strom Thurmond was a great role model, but his controversial actions show otherwise. By failing to communicate the whole truth about Strom Thurmond, Clemson University is effectively changing the perceived history of Clemson to be more pleasant, but this is ethically wrong. People deserve to know the truth about Strom Thurmond and Clemson as a whole. Knowing the history will allow us to learn from the mistakes of those who came before us in order to make a better future.
As previously discussed, Clemson University lies on historical land. Before the property was known as Clemson, famous Deep South political figure John C. Calhoun lived on the large plantation called Fort Hill, which consisted of well over 1,300 acres. Calhoun made the land his home for 25 years, beginning in 1825. Calhoun was seen as playing a significant role in the 19th century American government, many saying he was a catalyst in the Civil War. Calhoun had quite a resume in government, ranging almost 40 years. Over a century later, Senator John F. Kennedy named Calhoun one of the 5 greatest American senators in history. He even served as the vice president for 7 years, while maintaining his estate on Fort Hill. However, as busy as Calhoun was with national affairs, he stayed in Washington, D.C. more often than Fort Hill, South Carolina, but did find time to stay at his large plantation. Calhoun grew up around slavery. In fact, he formed a tight bond with one of his child slaves owned by his family, a boy named Sonny. They loved to fish and hunt together. As an adult, Sonny once said, "Many's the times in the boiling sun, me and Marse John has plowed together." Calhoun eventually gained custody of his childhood friend and was said to have given Sonny special privileges. Some of these privileges included allowing him to, quote, cultivate 4 or 5 acres of land for cotton and other things, the proceeds of which became his own property and sometimes produced $30 to $50 a season. By the time he left his estate and his son Andrew took over, Fort Hill had around 70 to 80 slaves. 10 years later, Fort Hill had accumulated 139 slaves. According to Clemson University's website, Calhoun viewed himself as the model slave owner, having said, quote,
The object of him who hires is generally to make the most he can out of him, without regard to the comfort of help, and usually to the entire neglect of the children and the sick. An excerpt from the website reads, quote, Calhoun insisted time after time that he was bound to do his duty in the role Providence had given him. As a man who owned slaves, he probably lived up to the just master's ideal as well as anyone. Nowhere in his letters does he say anything to ridicule or degrade his slaves, and nowhere does he express the slightest guilt or regret that he lived at Fort Hill in a house of privilege built on the forced labor of black men and women, end quote. Fort Hill slave quarters were about 1/8 of a mile from the house on the hill, located where Lee Hall is today. The living space was, quote, built of stone and joined together like barracks with gardens attached. The slave quarters were eventually torn down and were used as structural foundations for early academic buildings. The dead slaves were buried on what we call Cemetery Hill, which is adjacent to Death Valley. No one knows the exact number of slaves that were buried there, as their graves were marked only by indistinguishable field stones. The random field stones are somewhat symbolic of the Fort Hill slaves' experiences, as there exists no documented first-hand accounts from the slaves that once lived there. The stones are unable to tell us anything about the people that were here, except that they were here. Clemson's website acknowledges this, quote, since the slaves who occupied Fort Hill left no written record, their perspective is virtually voiceless in history, end quote. Clemson University should commemorate the people that essentially built this institution with more than historical markers. Perhaps they could raise statues or monuments. There is no way to undo history, but the ones that paid sacrifices should not be forgotten.
Another important founder of Clemson University was Thomas Green Clemson. Clemson was born into a wealthy Philadelphia family on July 1st, 1807. After Clemson's dad died when he was 7, he became enamored with the arts and intellectual life. Clemson later got his degree in Paris and became a successful engineer by 1831. During a business trip to Washington, D.C. in the spring of 1838, Thomas Clemson met Anna Maria Calhoun, the daughter of S.C. Senator John C. Calhoun. They would soon marry in the fall later that year. On the Clemson website, they make it seem like Clemson just married into the slave ownership lifestyle after marrying Anna and moving to her father's land of Fort Hill, with a quote saying, "Little is known about Clemson's thoughts concerning the Calhoun family's ownership of slaves." They also seem to do a good job of displaying the good things found in the detailed records of the plantation and the slave life that Clemson kept so Calhoun could read it, detailing things such as the slaves were given a 4-day holiday from labor and the use of the kitchen. This seems to be all in presenting positive information because I'm sure there was negative treatment that was recorded yet not described here. They also describe Clemson as a Confederate officer and a plantation and slave owner, but failed to present this information on the main statue that is so prevalent from the Tillman Hall, simply describing him as a scientist, diplomat, soldier. Breaking down these 3 words, leave out the fact that Thomas's big scientific inquiry was in agriculture, purchasing a 100-acre farm in Maryland where he conducted agriculture experiments, quote saying, documentation recorded that at the home, Clemson owned no slaves. This is a piece of information that should be presented on the plaque because it shows that Clemson, although married into a slave-owning family, later saw no need to own any in his estate in Maryland. Describing him as merely a soldier rather than a Confederate soldier may sway people to think of him as a hero, rather than putting in a word that carries a lot of negative connotation and would damage the character that the university is founded upon. If the real history of Clemson wants to be represented, then all the facts should be available or presented across all formats, whether it's statues, plaques, websites, or social media accounts.